More than 1.5 million Jews were killed in the camps Belzec, Sobibor and Treblinka between March 1942 and October 1943. The major part of them came from Poland, but many were also deported from the Netherlands, France, Germany and Austria, from Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia and Greece, as well as from Belarusia and Lithuania. Belzec received transports from March to December 1942, and about 500,000 Jews have been killed in this camp. At Sobibor, which was operating from May 1942 until October 1943, about 200,000 people were murdered. And in Treblinka, approximately 900,000 Jews died between July 1942 and August 1943. There were also Sinti and Roma being killed together with the Jews. The three camps were overseen by a small group of killing experts coming from the T4 action, the euthanasia, who were in charge of directing and supervising the death camps. At Sobibor, there were between 20 and 30 men during 1942, then this number rose to more than 30 men in 1943. More than 50 men were in charge in Treblinka during autumn 1942. At Belzec, there were only little more than 20 men. The personnel was supported by 100 to 120 guards from the camp Travniki, where former Soviet prisoners of war, mostly Ukrainians, had been trained for this purpose. Several hundreds of prisoners were used for labor-intensive works. Since the entire camps were called SS Sonderkommandos, the prisoners, including the ones working next to the gas chambers, were not called Sonderkommando as in Auschwitz, but simply Arbeitsjuden, working Jews. Less than 140 people survived the three camps by escaping before and during the revolts in Treblinka on 2nd August and Sobibor on 14th August 1943. In Treblinka, there were also survivors that were employed in the extermination areas. Therefore, I will focus on this camp rather than on Belzec and Sobibor. So this. As you can see in the drawing of Treblinka made by the survivor Samuel Willenberg, the camps were separated in distinct areas. There was a living sector for the German overseers, the Travniki guards and the prisoners. There was an area in which the trains arrived, in which the deportees had to get undressed, and where the belongings were sorted, the Aufnahmelager, the reception area. These two parts were called Camp 1, Lager 1 or Lower Camp. The area with the gas chambers and the pits was separated from this area by fence. This extermination area was called Upper Camp or Camp 2, Lager 2. The two areas were linked to each other with a tube, the Schlauch, a narrow path intertwined with tree branches which led from the undressing square to the gas chambers. It is difficult to reconstruct the history of the three camps since the structures of the camps and the camps' documentation were destroyed by the overseers in 1943. Historians have to analyze two kinds of sources. First of all, the witness statements recorded during the trials against the perpetrators of the camps, and secondly, the published and unpublished memories and interviews of the survivors, in particular the books of Rudolf Reder for Belzec, Thomas Blatt, Stanislav Schmeitzner, Philipp Bialowitz for Sobibor, and Richard Glaser, Jankel Wiernik, Samuel Willenberg, Frank Stiffel, Martin Gray, and Jill Reichmann for Treblinka. I will first give a short overview of the working Jews in the three extermination camps, including the amount and variety of commandos employed in the camps. Then I will explain the kind of work the prisoners were forced to do during the extermination process. In a final step, I will deal with the living and working conditions of the prisoners. In the beginning of the camp's history, the Jewish men who were selected from the incoming transports and employed in the camps were killed soon, often until the end of the day. But the camp staff realized that permanent working commandos were needed and that a hierarchical structure would be more efficient and more appropriate for the camp's security. Sobibor was the first camp to employ permanent working commandos in May 1942. There were about 600 to 700 men and women working in Sobibor during 1943, 300 of them working in the extermination area. More than 100 of them were female workers. Belzec had permanent commandos since July 1942. Almost 1,000 Jews were employed in the camp during summer and autumn 1902. Some of them were women. At Treblinka, there were permanent commandos since autumn 1942. More than 1,000 men and a few women were working there in 1942 during the mass deportation. The following year, the number of the prisoners employed in the camp was lower. The unique purpose of the three camps was the extermination. Nevertheless, there were jobs which were not linked directly to the mass murder. One group of prisoners was employed, for example, in the sorting of the belongings of all the victims and conducted activities like the Sonderkommando at Auschwitz-Birkenau. There were teams which sorted the clothes and other objects. There were the gold Jews, who dealt with valuables like money, gold, and jewels. Another group of prisoners, which was not linked directly to the mass extermination, worked as specialized craftsmen, as service prisoners. They were employed as cooks, bakers, cleaning staff, washerwomen, ironers, knitters, seamstresses, shoemakers, tailors, carpenters, masons, smiths, plumbers, goldsmiths, painters, musicians, office workers, hairdressers, doctors, pharmacists, dentists, gardeners, and keepers. One commander had the task to camouflage the barbed wire, intertwining it with 3 branches. Another worked outside the camps in the Waldkommando, the forestry team, and collected wood for the burning of the corpse. In Sobibor, there were some 50 craftsmen. There were between 80 and 100 craftsmen in Treblinka called, together with the gold Jews, Hofjuden, court Jews. But the majority of the prisoners were employed in work related directly to the extermination process called Transportabfertigung. Comparing them to Birkenau, we can state that they were fulfilling similar tasks as the Ramp Commando and the Sonderkommando. Nevertheless, the tasks fulfilled by the Sonderkommando at Birkenau were undertaken in the Reinhardt camps by several teams due to the division in a reception and an extermination area. The prisoners in the reception areas were employed at the ramps and at the undressing squares or barracks. They collected the belongings and took them to the sorting areas, and they worked as hair cutters. The prisoners in the extermination areas, who also lived there without any contact to the other side of the camp, cleaned the gas chambers, took the corpse to the mass graves, took out the gold teeth, and were employed in the disposal and the cremation of the corpse. I will give you an idea of the tasks of the Jews involved in the extermination process with the example of Treblinka during September and December 1942, after the reorganization of the camp. In September, about 180,000 Jews were killed after being deported from the districts of Warsaw, Radom and Lublin, and from Theresienstadt. The average death toll was about 6,000 persons every day. The old 3 gas chambers of the previous period were still in use. The 10 new ones were completed only in October. Between October and December, even Jews coming from Germany and from the region of Bialystok arrived at the camp. By October 1942, the number of victims reached its peak. 210,000 persons were killed, nearly 7,000 a day. It took less than 2 hours from the moment the deportees arrived at the ramp of the camps until their killing in the gas chambers. The drawing of the survivor Willenberg shows us the reception area, the Aufnahmelager. Each extermination process, which could be repeated during summer and autumn 1942 up to 6 times a day, usually concerned 20 freight cars, with more than 2,000 deportees who arrived on the ramp. They met the Travnicki guards and German overseers armed with pistols and leather whips, and the working Jews who worked on the ramp. The commando was called the Blue Commando and consisted of 30 to 50 prisoners who had brooms for cleaning the area. They helped the deportees to get out of the freight cars and extracted luggage and dead bodies. The Blue Commando waited until the deportees were sent to the undressing square and then cleaned the platform and the freight cars and splattered chlorine for disinfection. They threw the corpse in a pit near the so-called Lazarette and brought the luggage to the sorting square. They had to take the older, sick and injured deportees to the execution site, falsely called Lazarette Hospital, where these were killed by shooting. The Lazarette consisted of a pit and a small hut surrounded by fences of barbed wire, intertwined with tree branches. Also sick working Jews or small groups of Sinti and Roma were killed in this place. These deportees had to undress, helped by 3 working Jews, and were shot by German overseers or Travniki guards. Then the working Jews had to burn the bodies in the pit. The other deportees were received by the Red Commando, composed of 30 to 50 prisoners at the undressing site, the so-called Umschlagplatz. This commando was created only at the end of September 1942. Until that point, this task had been undertaken by men selected among the deportees and killed at the end of the day. One of the German overseers gave his commands, translated by one of the prisoners. The deportees were then divided into 2 groups. Men had to go to the right, while women and children went to the left. They took off their shoes on the square and entered the barrack to take off their clothing. The men had to undress outdoors on the square. Members of the Red Commando helped deportees who were not able or willing to undress on their own. They took sick people who have not been seen by the Blue Commando to the Lazarette. Some Go Jews were employed at the undressing site as well. Some collected the valuables belonging to the women in the undressing barrack. Others took gold, money and jewels outdoors among the men. Another group of prisoners, 25 to 13 haircutters, shaved the long hair of the women in a room inside the undressing barrack. Then the deportees had to enter the Schlauch and were directed to the gas chambers, accompanied by Travniki guards and overseers. In the meantime, the Red Commando brought all the belongings and clothes left by the deportees to the sorting square. Within a few minutes, they would clean up the square, the undressing barrack, and the first part of the Schlauch, searching for valuables, which were often buried by the deportees so that their perpetrators couldn't take them. The deportees entered the gas chambers through a corridor which led to 3, later 10 gas chambers, of which generally only 1 row was used. The doors were closed and men, women and children were killed by the exhaust gas of an engine operated by Travniki men and German overseers who were assisted by 1 or 2 working Jews. The exhaust gases were let in the gas chambers through a system of tubes. Between 15 to 20 minutes later, the deportees were dead, and the external doors of the single chambers were opened. The corpses were taken in charge by a prisoner team of about 60 prisoners. These men extracted the corpse from the chambers and took them to a ramp outside the gas chamber building. Men from the so-called cleaning commando used water from a well to clean the floor and the wall of the gas chambers from blood, urine and excrements. A painter whitewashed the walls. Some men cleaned the superior part of the tube. The so-called transport commando, composed of 40 to 60 carriers, took the corpse placed on the ramp and brought them to the mass graves. In the first weeks of the camp's history, the prisoners could use a light railway from the gas chambers to the mass graves for the transport of the corpse, but it turned out to be too slow, and the camp direction decided to abolish it and to only make use of the physical power of the prisoners. The men of the transport commando were forced to pull the corpse with belts and later on with stretchers made by wood similar to ladders. The prisoners, working in groups of 2, put the corpse on the stretcher and carried it to the mass graves, going around in a circuit. On the way to the gas chambers, the corpses were examined by dentists, who checked if they had gold teeth or hidden valuables. The dentists were composed of 20 gold Jews, who also had the task of cleaning the gold teeth and remove them from the tooth and to divide the valuables and the gold before they were taken to the lower camp. The mass graves were the working place of the Pit Commando, which was composed of 10 men. They had to pile up the corpse and the graves in rank and file, head by feet, in order to take short of place. Between the layer of corpse, they had to throw sand and chlorinated lime. The last level of corpse was covered with a deposit of sand. At the beginning of 1943 started the disposal and burning of the 800,000 corpses buried in the pits. It was carried out by the camp's overseers and the working Jews of the 3 camps, not by Global and the Commandos 1005. Until that moment, there had only been sporadic tests to burn the corpse. Also, the camps Belzec and Sobibor began the erasure of the crimes in late 1942. The disposal of the corpse started only after the visit of Himmler in the camps. The cremation system was very similar to the one used at Birkenau in 1942. The railroad tracks were installed on a base of cement above a flat pit forming a couple of rosters on which the corpses were arranged. The cremation was intensified with petroleum, gasoline, clothes and rags, and wood collected by the forest team, the Waldkommando. The Germans extracted the corpse in decomposition with 2 or 3 excavators from the pits. Working Jews had to remove the remaining parts of the dead bodies manually and with pitchforks. One group of prisoners arranged the corpse on stretchers, then the carriers took them to the cremation rows. This was the working place of the burning group, the Feuerkolonne. The men of this commando used pitchforks and hooks to line up the bodies on the rows, moving them from time to time until they were burned. Ashes and bones, not burned, were collected by the bones team, the Knochenkolonne. Big bones were thrown again on the fire. Small bones were given to the ash team, the Aschekolonne. They smashed the bones and controlled their work using closed meshed sieves. The ash was thrown by the ash team in the emptied mass graves. The pits were covered with a thick layer of sand and earth. A gardener team plants grass and flowers on them. A part of the ash was collected in sacks and scattered on the paths in the camps, and from the extermination camp to the working camp Treblinka. Belzec and Sobibor had similar extermination processes, but there are also some differences. The single commandos employed in Belzec and Sobibor had, for example, different names and partially varying functions, but it would take too long to explain every single difference. I will mention only one. If you have a look on Sobibor in the drawing of the German overseer Erich Bauer, you can note the light railway from the ramp to the camp 3, the extermination area. It was used to transport corpses and also elderly and sick deportees or babies without parents shot next to the mass graves in camp 3. The working Jews on the ramp had to fill the wagons with these deportees. In Belzec, the deportees who were not able to walk were killed as well as in the extermination area by gunshot next to the mass graves. So it was only Treblinka with the Lazarette which integrated a miniature of the extermination area also in the other part of the camp. The working Jews were organized hierarchically, similar to the organization in the concentration camps. Some of the German overseers had been deployed before the Second World War as SS-men in Sachsenhausen and Buchenwald. They adopted the same format by organizing the prisoners under capos and foremen. These prisoners had the responsibility to make the other prisoners work without problems. The capos and foremen used leather whips and had to apply corporal punishment. In Belzec, there were 2 Oberkapos, also named Zugführer, platoon leader, or Judenälteste, the eldest of the Jews, and some Unterkapos. The head of the prisoners at Sobibor was also an Oberkapo named Governor or General Governor. It was first Moshe Sturm from Poland, then Herbert Nathaniel, called Berliner, who was killed by the prisoners because he was known as a cruel informer. After his death, the head of the working Jews was Spitz from Holland. There was an Oberkapo in the extermination area in Camp 3 as well. There were also Blockälteste, the eldest of the barrack, who were responsible for the barracks and the number of the prisoners attending roll call. The head of the prisoners in Treblinka was Marceli Galewski, called eldest of the camp or camp commando. When suffering from typhus, he was replaced by Rakowski, who was killed by the German overseers. In the extermination area, there was an Oberkapo as well, first the Austrian Jew Blau, then another Austrian Singer. As in the concentration camps, there were roll calls in the morning and in the evening to count the prisoners and to assign jobs. They lived in separated areas, surrounded by fence or barbed wire. In Treblinka, they lived and worked since autumn 1942 in the so-called ghetto and in a barrack in the upper camp. In Sobibor, they lived and worked in the Camp 1, where the barracks and the offices were situated. In the extermination area in Camp 3, they had their living rooms in an extra fenced barrack. The prisoners at Belzec, Sobibor and Treblinka wore civilian clothes, not uniforms. At Treblinka, their hair were cut in 1943. They had prisoner numbers on leather stripes and were registered. In Belzec and Sobibor, there was only a control over their quantity. They were not registered by name. The living conditions of these prisoners were characterized by a lack of hygiene, water, and nutrition. The prisoners were treated with constant violence and followed severe rules. Punishment was frequent and took the form of whipping, penal labor, executing by shooting or sport, which often took place during the evening roll calls. They risked their life every day, especially in 1942, when they could easily be replaced with newcomers from the transports. Sick prisoners were killed. On the other hand, we can state, if compared to the concentration camps, that the prisoners had open spaces. For example, men and women could talk with each other freely. In 1943, at Sobibor and Treblinka, after a typhus epidemic, infirmaries operated by prisoner doctors were created, where the sick prisoners could stay up to 3 days. The daily life of the prisoners who worked and lived in the extermination areas were worse. Not only concerning the kind of work they had to do in constant contact with deaths. In Treblinka, they had to run all the time, especially the carriers, who were easily replaceable since they were not specialized craftsmen. They were beaten continuously, and many of them were killed. They had no chance to organize new clothes in the magazines like the other prisoners did to avoid typhus or other epidemic. They had no access to extra nutrition. Until 1943, there were no hygiene measures. Only in 1943, some female workers were transferred to the upper camp to wash the clothes of the prisoners. Many prisoners tried to commit suicide. Only in the first period, until the reorganization, prisoners could also escape from the extermination areas. Concluding. Compared with the Sonderkommando at Birkenau, we can state many similarities. For example, the way the gas chambers were cleaned, the gold teeth were pulled, or the ashes were treated. But there are also differences due to the different extermination processes. First of all, tasks fulfilled by the Sonderkommando at Birkenau were overtaken by several commandos in the Reinhard camps as a consequence of the division of the camps in 2 parts. The workers of the reception area dealt with the persons who were still alive. The working Jews in the extermination areas received dead, naked bodies, and they were the only one who lived in a separate sector. The second difference was the cutting of the hair, which in Belzec, Sobibor and Treblinka was done by hair cutters before the murdering, which meant a saving of time. The number of the bodies in the mass graves before the exhumation and cremation was much higher than the one in Auschwitz. We have to consider that at the beginning of the burning action, at the end of 1942, the camps had nearly fulfilled their task to kill the entire Jewish population of the general government. The major parts of the corpse were first buried and then, months later, exhumed and burned. Last but not least, it was also the big number of deportees killed that made a difference. If you remember that at Treblinka it was possible to repeat 6 times the extermination process, reaching over 12,000 victims in a single day. Thanks for your attention.